Thomas Matrusa.
She'll know.
Okay.
It's cold, so I don't want to breathe on anybody. I know. It's like, how's everything?
I don't know if you've ever met.
See you next week, right?
Yeah, Amanda.
We have a full agenda. We just have built up every single one of the times, so we're adding them to the next.
Great. You should have been at the last one. It was so short. We were out at 8. And like, really?
Yeah, she told me.
Oh, well, yeah, no.
She was annoying.
But everyone was really happy. There was like nothing amazing.
Hi, I mean,
It varies 10 to 15. Yeah, so, but there's, we always have a group that she'll be here.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. But we're going to make up for this. Because we're probably
Between this one and like May is going to be like
So most people go to Florida that have houses down there from November to like March, April. Yeah, so there'll be a lot of people like yeah, because people start coming out, you know, it's lighter, longer. I don't know what time she wants to do, day or night. I think she'll get a better turnout. Well, deal with David Becker, who is he's a manager, he's a double settlement manager, and so they get very territorial, as men often do, about who comes and how it's posted, and I'd rather have their buy-in, so that we don't have a problem. And I'll follow up. I will call him. Yeah, I'm saying you can back out. I'll call him. Yeah. I know his number off the top of my head. If you want it, I can give it to you right now. So his name is David Becker. D-E-C-K-E-R. And he's the regional manager at Big Sense. And his number is 768-897-2. That's his office. And his backup in the office, who is very competent assistant, is Tamma, T-A-M-A. She can help you too. And you can say, I gave her.
oh yeah.
Be good to have her.
I know. Whenever Tish comes to.
I didn't see her really at the parade. I didn't get to really see her. Yeah. I saw her. She was. I was marching with Joe, and she was on the side of that line. So we were calling her out to show James. You know, that's what she likes to say. Of course. Did you go? Yeah, I felt bad.
Everything good?
I'll see you
Next week.
Another homeowners association.
You're welcome.
I don't know from day to day.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
it was a
I
project.
saw that, and I was thinking,
discussion.
I was with him at
Well,
the
David and I were stable, so.
stinking parade. And
No, he was sick already. And then he was sick, so March was great.
Go ahead.
Right. You feel well,
I don't wanna give them any
infect everybody else. Yeah, and I saw her Saturday.
Frank told me that.
I love her. I really do. She's awesome. Yeah, she can just get up and articulate.
I don't know what day it is.
Did she? Good. Yeah, that's how Excuse me, John. Do you know I can get a glass of water?
I'll be right back. I'll get it for you.
I may have
All right, so ladies and gentlemen, the commissioner's about a minute out. Somehow he got stuck in Queens traffic, which of course we all know and love. Someone should really talk to their borough president about that. If I could get a shovel out, I would myself, to help the streets, but we all know the traffic here. We want to wish everyone a very happy St. Patrick's Day, we've gone to many celebrations over the last few days, and so we want to wish everyone a very happy St. Patrick's, Aziz and Pesach. To those of you that are celebrating Passover coming up, and a great Easter to those of you celebrating that, and to those of you celebrating both, like my family, have a great time. Yeah, we're, huh? New Year, Asian? Yes. Happy Lunar New Year, happy St. Patrick's Day, happy.
And then St. Joseph.
I knew I was going to get in trouble once I started. Imagine this, no. So, we also want to do. Is Donna downstairs?
Yes, she's waiting downstairs.
In accordance with Section 13 of the Borough Board bylaws, the following vice chairs have been designated by their respective chair to serve as an alternate at the meeting on March 12, 2018. Second vice chair, Renata English, for chairman Philip Pappas in Ward 3, and first vice chair, Giancarlo Castano, for chairman Damian Vargas, CB4. I'll accept a motion to approve the designation. Second. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Thank you very much. The motion is carried. We do want to congratulate Raj. My understanding is it's your last meeting as chair.
Yes. Really? Yes.
I think congratulations. I'm not quite sure. I think. Is it a congratulations or not a congratulations? We hope, we thank you for the work that you did as chair of Board 9. You really, I have to tell you, you really pulled the board together at a time when it needed to be pulled together. And you were the right guy for the right job at the right time. And at this table, I'm sure that I appreciate you more than anyone. But we do appreciate that. We want to thank the council members who have joined us. We have Council Member Credentia, Council Member Adams, Council Member Holden, Council Member Koo, Council Member Van Bramer. We're going to have the Commissioner of Homeless Services every year, every month. The Commissioner is on his way, but I have an agreement to start, if that's okay?
Yes.
Okay. So, the New York City Human Resources, first of all, is there anybody here from anyone's office that they're representing, any elected officials? So, starting here, can you stand up and introduce yourselves and who you're representing?
Good afternoon, my name is Stephanie Charles. I represent Councilmember Adrian Adams.
Okay.
I work as their director of business.
Okay. Just who you're representing, and
Hi, Stacey Elliott from the Public Advocate's Office.
Is this James?
Elaine from City Controller Stockton Road's office.
Thank you for coming.
I'm Andrew Toronto from Senator Commer's office.
Thank you.
Yang Chun from Councilmember Gordon's office.
Thank you.
Louise Emmanuel, Assemblyman North's office.
And let's see. All right, I sold long enough. I am going to, so the New York City Human Resources Administration Department of Social Services is dedicated to fighting poverty and income inequality by providing New Yorkers in need with essential benefits such as food assistance and emergency rental assistance. As the largest local social service agency in the country, HRA helps over 3 million New Yorkers with the administration of more than 12 major public assistance programs with more than 14,000 employees and operating a budget of $9.7 billion. Is that right? No. Is that right? Wow. Of course I knew that because I wrote every word. With us tonight is Commissioner Steve Banks, and he'll deliver a status update on Turning the Tide Homeless Initiative. Commissioner will also speak about the current state of homelessness in Queens. We welcome Commissioner Banks, but if you can introduce yourselves, we would appreciate it.
Sure. Good evening. My name is Lori Boozer. I'm the Special Advisor for the Department of Social Services and Governmental Affairs here.
Some of you might know me. I'm Amanda Naser. I'm the Queensborough Director for the Department of Homeless Services for External Affairs.
And for the council members who just walked in, the commissioner's just stuck in traffic. He was a block away a minute ago, which doesn't make any sense. Because, I mean, it doesn't surprise me, because it takes a half hour sometimes to go a few blocks in the borough. So would you like to commence?
Sure. Can I take this one? Breaking not off to a good start. Just social services. Great. So good evening. Thanks. We know that everyone is really most interested in hearing from Commissioner Banks. We also have coming with him Administrator Jocelyn Carter, as well as our new Director of Strategic Initiatives, former Councilmember Annabelle Palma. And as you know or may know, this year is marking the first year anniversary of our Turning the Tide plan, which is the plan that Mayor de Blasio announced when he first took office as an approach to sort of transform the way in which the city was addressing its homelessness issue. So we would all agree and not dispute that homelessness is a crisis here in New York City. We have over 60,000 individuals currently residing in our shelter system. It's a number that we take very seriously and are constantly working as an agency to find ways to sort of mitigate that number. Under the Turning the Tide plan and Mayor de Blasio's new perspective on how to address this issue, we wanted to build 90 new facilities across the city so that we could end the haphazard way in which the system has built up over time. Most of our system currently consists of families with children. We do have single adult men, women, and adult families. Oftentimes, in terms of the face of homelessness and what that looks like for us as an agency, most people aren't aware that it's predominantly families with children. About 30% of our families are employed. When we look at statistics for our single adults, it's roughly 3,000 or so within that population that make up the system. And in terms of our adult families, the thing that we've been trying to highlight as we enter into the anniversary year is what an adult family looks like when they are homeless. So we're looking at individuals who are disabled, families who have adult disabled children, and individuals who may be caretaking for an older relative. And so across the spectrum of the system, those are sort of the populations that we serve. And as an agency, we not only committed to building 90 new high quality facilities, we've also committed to a prevention effort to make sure that we can address the factors that are driving people into the shelter system. So a part of that was really increasing the financing and the commitment to provide legal service access to individuals who are facing eviction. We've been able to prevent a significant number of evictions under the plan, and I think the commissioner is here. Yes. So I'm sure you'd rather hear from him.
The commissioner can come sit here, please. We appreciate it. Hi, how are you? So we just like a minute ago. I thought it would take you longer to get a few blocks from Queens, you know?
It did take me quite a while.
A few blocks. We do our best, but they were just going over the makeup of homeless, which is just the 30% that are working, and that was about as far as we got. So let me just introduce Commissioner Banks. Commissioner Banks and I know each other well through his years at Legal Aid and the work that we did on behalf of the City of New York when he was working at Legal Aid and in the various jobs that he has had for the city. I have great respect for the Commissioner, and I have great respect for the job that he has to do. And it's not always an easy job, as we all know. Taking care of folks in the City of New York is our obligation. And it's not always the easiest of knowing where, when, and how to place people, and then moving them from the shelter system into affordable housing without the benefits of the city. And so he tries to do that every day. We all know that there are issues that have come up in our districts, and I know that you'll bring them up. But I do respect the fact this is the second time that the Commissioner is here within, I think, a year, if I'm not mistaken. And last time he was here, we had notification issues when the hotels are being used for homeless. The system has stood up to the obligation, or to the commitment that he had made, which is that we have been notified when the hotels have been utilized. I know there have been some questions on the timing and all of that, and you can ask the Commissioner when he's done. I do want to welcome Annabelle Palma, especially. I know, Annabelle and I served together in the New York City Council for a lot of years. And congratulations on your new position. It shows that you at least have taste. That's a good thing. Judgment, good judgment, good judgment. And so we expect that there will be questions, but I'd like the Commissioner please to do his layout. Talk about the plan of moving folks into a shelter system in their own communities, which allows children to keep going to school, where children have been going to school, and allows grandparents to still help with their grandchildren so that the children can go out and work. And so I look forward to hearing the Commissioner's words. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Borough President. Thank you for your very kind words. Yes, we do know each other a long time, but since we're very young people, it's only about 2 years.
I was 10. Well, then,
10. Thank you very much for having me again. I apologize for being delayed. We did leave plenty of time, but welcome to the traffic. Take this up for next time. Telephone calls. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you all again, both council members and members, representatives from different boards. Annabelle Palma, many of you know, I wanted to introduce you to Jocelyn Carter, who's the administrator of the Department of Homeless Services. Some of you know this, and I'll touch on this a little later, but I want to just highlight it that one of the things we did about 2 years ago, the mayor asked me to conduct a review of homeless services in New York City. At that time I was the HRA commissioner, and the delivery of homeless services hadn't been looked at in 20 years, and one of the things that happened 20 plus years ago was splitting the Department of Homeless Services out of HRA, which as we looked at it didn't really have the kind of results that were needed. It created inefficiencies both from a client perspective and also from a staff perspective, and we created an integrated agency of HRA and DHS, each with its own administrator. Jocelyn Carter is the administrator of the Department of Homeless Services, and Grace Bonita, by no, Councilmember Jen as well, is the administrator of HRA, and I'm the commissioner of the integrated agencies. So let me start off by just giving you some facts on the ground for Queens, and then I want to lay out for you what the plan is to address the situation. So in Queens right now, there are, from Queens, in the city shelter system, are 8,371 people. Those are residents of Queens who have lost their housing, and they're in shelters throughout the city, not just in Queens. And within Queens, there are 10,513 people. So more people are housed in the borough than come from the borough. In the borough, there are 69 shelters. 28 of them are traditional freestanding shelters. They preceded me. Some of them opened during this administration. But there are also 38 hotels that are in use. All 38 of those hotels are going to be closed under the plan. And those hotels currently shelter about 5,000 people. And if you take away the 5,000 from the 10,513, you end up with a deficit of about 2,800. I'm rounding slightly. You end up with a deficit of about 2,800. And that is our challenge in transforming the shelter system from a very haphazard one into one in which it's really truly a borough-based system, in which if you should lose your housing, you could be sheltered as close as possible to your children's schools, to your employment, to your health care, and so forth. So that is a challenge in the plan, to be able to have sufficient shelter for that gap once we close all those hotels. Now let me step back a moment, because so much of the focus on homelessness is about hotels or shelters. The plan that we announced a year ago really has 4 pillars in it, and I want to report to you on progress and challenges for each of them, and they're all instructive of how challenging and complicated the issue is. So first, there's prevention. Second, there's bringing people in off the streets. Third, there's rehousing people into permanent housing. And fourth, there's transforming the approach to the way that the city has provided shelter for the last 40 years, frankly. A background issue that I know we spoke about when I was here about a year ago is that there has been a 115% increase in homelessness between 1994 and 2014, including a 38% increase between 2011 and 2014, when the city and state ended rental assistance for homeless families and homeless individuals, which created that bottleneck in the shelter system and that surge of growth. Background issue that I know you hear about from constituents, and I know I hear about it from the borough president when we talk, which is between 2005 and 2015, rents went up 18.4%, wages went up 4.8%. Let me repeat that. Across the city, between 2005 and 2015, rents went up 18.4%, wages went up 4.8%. If this was a math class, we would do a theorem. If you have rents exceeding incomes, you will have homelessness. And that is what has built up in the city over a number of years. When I first began representing homeless people in New York City in the early 1980s, late 1970s, there were very few families who were homeless. There are now 70%, as Lori said earlier, of the shelter system is families in our system. And 34% of the families with children in the system have an adult who's working. Again, reflective of that 8.4% increase in rents and 4.8% increase in wages. Midway through the first term of the administration, as I said, the mayor asked me to conduct a review of homeless services, which led to a number of management changes in the delivery of homeless services and some of the earlier reforms. And about a year ago, the mayor announced a Turn of the Tide plan that is aimed at addressing a very haphazard delivery of homeless services that has built up during these last several decades. The first year results are in, and let me review them with you, and I'm obviously going to give time for questions. So for the first time in a decade, the Department of Homeless Services shelter system census is flat year to year. This is against a constant increasing census for more than a decade. This is the first year to year it's been flat. It's flat at a high number, not a number that we want to remain at, but it's the first time in a decade, year to year, there's been essentially no growth. In terms of prevention, that first pillar that I talked about, we have expanded legal services with the support of the council. We now are the first city in the United States that has universal access to counsel to be phased in over the next 5 years, beginning this year. But we had already begun to expand access to legal services in housing court. As I know so many of you, I heard about in my prior life, you had constituents that couldn't get lawyers, landlords were uniformly represented, tenants are not. And we have substantially increased representation. At the end of the 5 years, all tenants will have representation. But during the first 4 years of implementing access to counsel, evictions are down by 27%, 5% in the last year alone. Evictions by marshals are down 27%, 5% in the last year alone. That means 70,000 people remained in their homes, kept their homes that otherwise would have been evicted in the absence of this approach over the last several years. And as we continue to implement the program, more and more people will avoid losing their homes and stay in their homes. So that's the report on the first of the 4 pillars, prevention. In terms of street homelessness, I don't know if any of you read that heartbreaking story in the New York Times recently about someone who died on the streets in 2016. Someone who had gone to terrific college, had a very promising career ahead of her, and ended up on the streets and died on the streets in 2016. She had been contacted by outreach teams more than 300 times, but had refused help at all times. 2016, 2017, we put a new approach in the Mayor's Homestead program, and over the last year we have brought in 1,480 people from the streets. Previously the metric was always how many people did you bring in, how many people did you bring in, but this metric is how many people have we brought in since April 2016 who have remained off the street. It's not a program that's focused on making contacts, it's a program that's focused on bringing actual people off the streets and having them remain off the streets. And we've done that by doubling the number of outreach workers who are out 24/7. Some of you have contacted us frequently about people in your districts. I know it's frustrating to you. We follow every request, and some of those 1,480 people are people that came off the streets from Queens. We doubled the number of outreach workers. As I said, we've doubled the number of special safe haven beds. And these are really the beds that help us bring people in from the streets. And over the course of the next year, we'll be adding additional beds so that all together we will triple the number of safe haven beds to keep bringing people in off the streets. In terms of rehousing, permanent housing, as I said, one of the biggest drivers of this exponential growth in homelessness was that 3-year period, 2011 and 2014, when the city tried to address homelessness without any permanent housing. And the system grew by 38%. And so we have rebuilt rental assistance programs, largely with city dollars, some state contribution, not much federal, and the city programs, including rehousing initiatives as well as rental assistance, have resulted in 71,000 people, largely moving out of shelter, although some of them were prevention as well, but majority, vast majority, were rehousing initiatives. And we will continue to do that. And that's the prevention plus rehousing people, getting people into permanent housing is how we've stabilized the system over the last year. In addition, supportive housing, which is particularly important for single adults, but families of children as well. The initiative to increase the amount of supportive housing is just now coming online. First 400 or so units have come online and for the first numbers of people to move out. And every year, additional supportive housing will be coming online. Lastly, transforming the approach to shelter. For many years, the approach to shelter was if you became homeless, it was like going to a bakery, whatever was available was given to you. And so I can remember when Melinda and I were very, very young people I worked in Staten Island, and clients from the Bronx would be sent to Staten Island, and clients from Staten Island would be sent to Brooklyn, and so on and so forth. And that's the system that we have inherited that we are working steadily to fix, so that we will have, for the first time in 40 years, a organizing principle of how we approach shelter, which is community and people first. People come from someplace, we want to keep them as connected, closely connected as possible to those places, where their houses of worship are, where their families are, where their friends are, where their health care is, where their jobs, and where their kids go to school. So that we can stop this situation where children are moved across the boroughs and end up in one school, and they should be in the school they wanted to be with at the beginning of the school year. And then you'll have children in schools that are the kids who are in the neighborhood. They may have lost their housing, but they're going to be in those schools that the kids are used to being in. And without the kind of pressures on local schools that have developed over the years with this approach to providing shelter that had no organizing principle. There's been a lot of talk about 90 shelters, but it's important to remember the other part of the equation. It's about closing 360 locations, cluster sites and hotels. The city began 18 years ago a program called Clusters, in which apartments were rented. Obviously, everyone's aware of the tragedy that happened in one of those units a little over a year ago. Children were killed. That was an 18-year program in which units were rented and taken off the market, and typically the conditions were substandard. And the other program, of course, is commercial hotels, which you're familiar with in Queens. This is a program that dates back off and on to the Lindsay administration. During the Lindsay administration, HRA workers even put families up in the Waldorf Astoria, given the kinds of pressures that people had then. And when we announced that we would, a year ago, we would close all the hotels and close all of the cluster locations, 360 locations, we said we were going to ultimately shrink the footprint of the shelter system by 45%. And we would do that by replacing those 360 locations with a smaller number of 90 shelters. We have opened 11 of those shelters so far. We've announced a total of 17. 6 will be opening over the next several months, and that will have a total of 17 shelters up and operating. And we have more that are coming to us. We will be sending shortly to all local elected officials and community boards, offering people the opportunity to provide us with sites. We have had in some neighborhoods elected officials come forward with specific sites, which we appreciate receiving, and we want to continue to encourage that as we go along over the course of the next several years with this plan to close places and open places. The places that have been closed are the clusters. We were very clear that we were going to prioritize getting out of clusters first. We're out of almost half the cluster apartment units. We've closed 1,500 of them. That's 42% of the total that we were in when we began this process, 3,600. And we announced also recently that we're seeking to purchase 25 to 30 buildings and to convert cluster units into permanent housing for homeless families at those sites or other homeless families. And if we were unable to work an out-of-court arrangement by financing not-for-profit providers to purchase those buildings and operate them as low-income housing, that we would use the government's power of eminent domain to take the buildings, of course, compensating the owners. And that will bring another 800 units offline, and another 800 families with children will be able to move out of shelter. One of the problems of the past in terms of operations of shelters is that things open in the middle of the night. For each of the 17 shelters that we have opened, we have given in every one of them the amount of notice that the mayor and I committed to give, which is 30 days. And of the 11 sites that are open, the average time is 65 days between notification and opening. Where we can, we've made changes in our operation of the shelters based upon the input that we've gotten. Every one of those shelters that's operating now has every one of those 11 new shelters has a community advisory board in which they meet regularly and input is given. And the NYPD, I think I've said this before, is helping manage our shelter security. That perspective, I was here, Joe, part of our NYPD management of our operations, and that's part of how we open the new shelters. But hotels are obviously a concern in Queens because most of the hotels are here. But if you go back to that calculation that I gave you at the beginning, which is we're bringing a system in balance, numbers of people from a borough to be in balance with the numbers of people sheltered in the borough, that avoids what I've heard many of you say to me privately, well, there's so many hotels in Queens, aren't you just going to open shelters in every hotel in Queens? The answer to that is no, because we're looking to have a balanced system which is borough-based, in which the numbers of people that come from a borough can be sheltered there. Of course, there are special considerations for domestic violence survivors and others that have special needs, but it's basically a borough-based program to balance the numbers in shelter from a particular borough, the numbers from shelter in a particular borough. So we will be closing all of those hotels that I described, and we will be looking for new shelters. Where we can, we announced that 25 of the 90 shelters will be purpose-built, particularly for families with children. That's our priority. Not every building is appropriate to house families with children in. Other buildings can be converted, particularly for single adults or adult families. So we've been able to convert hotels and not have them operate as hotels into shelter space for single adults and adult families. We just did that with 2 shelters in Midtown Manhattan. One of them is open and operating on 31st Street, and a second is slated to open on 58th Street. Of those 17 shelters, 11 of which are operating, of the first tranche of these shelters, 9 are in the Bronx, 5 are in Brooklyn, 2 in Manhattan, 1 has been announced in Queens.
Those 17 shelters, is that
of the 17 shelters, yeah. The first one was recently announced. It's not open and operating yet. But again, it's towards that stated goal that has never existed with the operation of the shelter system, which is that there'll be a number of people that are going to become homeless from different boroughs, and the numbers of people that will be housed there will be the people from that borough, and we will be looking to site people as close as possible to the community from which we came. We're in year 1. It's a multi-year plan. It is challenging if you live in a community where there are cluster units in the Bronx, for example, and we're opening more shelters in your district because we're not going to be able to close the clusters overnight. Similarly, it is challenging if you are in a district where we've got hotels and we can't close them overnight either because we need to shelter people when they come in. So it's a transition of opening and closing, but it's a citywide system with a borough-based approach. And so the fact that we may have multiple units, and I know we've spoken about Community Board 12, and I was out over the summer with you, the fact we might have multiple units there, we're going to get out of them, but the road to getting out of them may require us to site shelters, because ultimately we need to come in balance for this borough just as if we're moving to come in balance with every other borough. Staten Island, there's no shelter yet there, but there's 1,300 people in our shelter system from Staten Island. And we only have capacity for about 140 people roughly in Staten Island. And we've been very clear that we're going to be looking to make sure that people from Staten Island are able to be sheltered in Staten Island and not in one of the other boroughs. Look, I'm as impatient as anybody in this room. I'm a legal aid lawyer by training, now running 2 agencies that I sued a lot. I'm as impatient as anybody to make change. Just ask the people who work with me how impatient I am to make change. On the other hand, we're not perfect either. And there are challenges in operating the system and moving forward with this sea change in how we're providing shelter. If you're in the middle of it, you might not see the change, but step back and you'll begin to see the changes. Ask the 70,000 people that are in their homes today because of the eviction prevention services that took place, or the 71,000 people who moved out, or the people that aren't in clusters anymore. Eventually, I think the borough president will invite me to a meeting here. We'll be able to say and ask the people that are in commercial hotels that aren't in commercial hotels anymore.
There you go. I look forward to that.
I look forward to that too. Happy to take questions.
So,
Thank you for giving me this opportunity.
I appreciate it. Before you go, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page, because the commissioner deals with this citywide, so just from a Queens perspective, if I can. So, can you tell me when I'm wrong? So 8,000...
Gently. It's your house.
There's 8,371 people from Queens in the homeless system right now. That are from Queens.
And there could be in any borough.
We have right now 10,513 people housed in the borough of Queens. There are 69 shelter sites here, but that is not all standalone shelters. The shelter sites include not only standalone shelters, which there's 28 of those, but the rest of those sites, which I guess my math is okay, 41, means that, what?
38 hotels.
38. So there's 38 hotels,
And there's 3 of something else.
and
Can I
there's
say what
3 of
those are?
some, you can say what I was going to, yeah, go ahead.
One drop-in center,
Okay?
which has got safe haven beds, and 2 short-term veterans.
So the language is just so everybody's on the same page. The shelters, there's 28 of them, freestanding permanent shelters, and the rest of the sites of the 69 in Queens are just are either hotels, which rooms are being rented, or entire hotels that are being rented. And so just so we're on the same page. And in 4 years, what the city is hoping to do is have 90 shelter sites standalone citywide. Do you know how many of those are expected in Queens to replace the 40 or so hotels?
Let's talk about that, and I think it's a good question to ask, which is, in the hotels now, there's about 5,000 people. And some of those are families with children, and typical size of a family with children is 1 adult and 2 kids. So, you know, Councilmember Benchik is very fast at math. So, you know, if you divide 3,000 into, you know, assume you've got 3,000 people in families, but some singles as well. You know, we've been trying to keep shelters anywhere between 50 to 200 in terms of people, in terms of units. So we've had shelters for 200 men. We've had some shelters for, you know, 150 women. We've had some shelters for 35 families, some shelters for 150 adult families. So it depends on what the siting looks like and what kind of program we can put in place. So there's not a goal that says we're going to replace the 38 hotels with 38 shelters. It could be less than that. It could be more than that, depending on what the size is.
Okay. All right, I'm going to start with Councilmember Adams, and then Jimmy, Councilmember Van Bramer, and then we're going to go to a chair, if you have one, and then Councilmember Holden and Councilmember Cook. Okay? We're doing it in that order.
Thank you for being here, Commissioner. It's always a pleasure to hear your updates and to hear from you. We've been around the block numerous times on this issue, as Community Board 12 has had for decades the highest number of homeless shelters in the entire borough of Queens. Councilmember Richards asked me to ask more about, more transparency and equity within Southeast Queens. So I'm just going to expound a little bit, I think, on what he's trying to get to. Given that we now have still the highest bed count in the entire city right now, in Community Board 12. And we're looking right now at the borough-wide initiative with your borough-based plan. How are we going to get to true equity in Southeast Queens through your borough-based plan? How are we really going to get there?
So let's talk a little bit about, if you don't mind, if we could talk a little bit about your area, because we've spoken before, and we had I thought a very good meeting over the summer. I think so. So by having an organizing principle for the shelter system, it changes the approach that has resulted in all the things you all have in your districts now. Because it creates an underlying principle, which is, as the borough president said, if you've got X number from the borough, you can expect to have X number of New Yorkers or, you know, men, women, children housed in the borough. Then if you take your district that we looked at together, you've got a lot of hotels. And in a world in which all you use is hotels, you're going to have many more people in your area than have become homeless from there. So, as we discussed over the summer, ultimately, as the plan is completed, all those hotels are going to be gone. You're going to be left with, in that area of Queens, capacity to house the numbers of people from that general area. It's never going to be a one-to-one mathematical, oh my God, we have 100 people and now you want to get to 101. It's got to be a little bit more flexible. It's a very large system to operate, and they're human beings that are involved here. But the principle we talked about over the summer and that I talked about tonight is the organizing principle. Can I get there tonight? Am I probably going to infuriate you? by coming before we can close the hotels, by saying I need to open a shelter, because this one's gonna be here for a long time and these are gonna go. I don't wanna be disingenuous, because the road to transforming the system means that, you know, we've all done the work where, you know, you're sort of doubling up in that sort of initial reform period, and then ultimately you're gonna get to a good place. That is hard on elected officials and community board members. I totally understand. And I really understand where people are coming from, which is you guys said you're gonna have this borough-based plan, but still there's more here, and there are none in Staten Island yet, or there are none here, or there. I get the challenge of trying to make this major change. I said it recently in a newspaper. There's a reason why nobody tried to do this ever before. Because it was easier to use clusters, it was easier to rent hotel rooms, and it was easier not to have these kind of principles. But jumping into the water is what's critically needed for our clients and also for you and your communities. But I want to, we've known each other a while. I know there's going to come a time during the life of this plan, and I have no idea whether it's sooner or later, where I may infuriate you by you're going to say, I still have all these hotel rooms here, it's like 3 times as much as I'm supposed to have, and I'm going to say to you, I need to get a shelter up, and ultimately the plan is going to have the vision that we all embrace. You're going to tell me about how do I know you're here forever running this agency, and I'm going to tell you it's been a pretty clearly laid out plan, and I think it would be very hard for someone else to say, we're not going to have a borough-based plan. We're going to go back to the haphazard plans. We're going to put all the hotels in community board 12. It's going to be very hard for our successors to back away from that.
So I'm going to ask that we try to, I know you want to give thorough answers, but I think a lot of people have questions, right? I understand you're a lawyer, so not here. But no, a lot of people have questions. Did I hear where the Queen's shelter is going about that? Did I hear that part, or did I miss that part?
And Councilmember Van Bramer, sister.
In Councilmember.
And I think he's the next person.
Councilmember Van Bramer, you're up.
Thank you. So, listen, it pains me to have to say what I'm going to say, but I actually believe that haphazard is exactly how I would describe how things are being handled in Community Board 2 in Queens right now, not just what was happening. I think your description of, well, that's where the hotels are, and so you all who have a lot of hotels in your district are going to get a lot of shelters and commercial hotels transferred into shelters is not exactly what I would consider a thoughtful plan. It is unfair to the people of Community Board 2, Blissville and Long Island City in particular. I would also say your notification of what you did at the City View, for example, evicting families with almost no notice in the middle of the night, and then moving in single men. We've now had lots of issues with that, only to then cite the first permanent shelter in Queens a few blocks away from that shelter, that hotel. And again, it's not a newly built shelter, purpose-built shelter. It's merely a commercial hotel that you're using as a permanent shelter. And I have deep concerns because you talked about Staten Island. I think this mayor has made political deals in certain places to close shelters, yet you are inundating other communities with new shelters and new commercial hotels. That's haphazard. That's not a plan. And that's deeply disturbing to me. What I think you're saying to you and myself, and maybe with Councilmember Adams, but I'll speak for myself, is there is no measure of imbalance that we will not pursue until we magically close all of these hotels. If you have faith and confidence in this plan that we're going to close all of these hotels. And let me just say, you have conveniently left the deadline to close the hotels until after all of us leave office. So I don't have faith and confidence in this plan. I don't think it's real. And I think what you're doing right now is in fact haphazard. And it's deeply unfair to Community Board 2, residents of Blissville, Long Island City. You have now cited 3 or 4 different shelters within the same several blocks of a community, within a several month span. That is what you have done to the people of Blissville and Long Island City. And let me just say, our district and this council member have been incredibly supportive on this issue, incredibly supportive of this issue. But there comes a time when we have to call your agency and this mayor out on a plan that is not, in fact, consistent with the values that I think you've laid out here. It is haphazard. You also talked about the size of the shelters and what you're striving for the shelters. The first permanent shelter in Queens, in Blissville, is much larger than all the shelters that you just said in terms of a desired size. 154 units, adult families, talking about well over 300 people. Both of those exceeding the numbers that you just cited as what I think would be an ideal size for a shelter. This after we helped you open a 200 bed mental health facility for single women. We have done right as a community board, and I know our chair is here, but particularly when deals are cut, political deals are cut in other places, I have to call that out on behalf of the people of my district who are not insensitive to the plight of the homeless. In fact, they're good and decent people who have been there. And you know that I have been in my shelters, and I have done the right thing. But this is too much. You are overburdening some communities, and I believe that there is no level of imbalance that you will deem unacceptable as you pursue this.
So let me just acknowledge, I appreciate all the work that we've done together. You've been very supportive and very helpful. I know we're having a serious disagreement here, but I want to just make one thing clear, or two things clear. I didn't say that there was no level of imbalance, because I didn't say the comment before, which is that wherever there's a hotel, we're just going to use it. I think I said the opposite, which is don't be worried every time there's a hotel, because at the end of the day, we're going to have to bring the borough into balance. There are more hotels here than we could use to bring the borough into balance. So if we were simply going to say every hotel's fair game, we wouldn't be here. Second thing, we wouldn't be able to deliver on the plan that we laid out here. The second thing I just want to make sure is clear to you and everyone. I talked about units. So we've had shelters of 200 men in beds. We've had shelters of 150 units for families or families with children. And so you can disagree with me, but I just want to make sure we have a common set of facts. I'm not saying we're going to use every hotel in your district or anyone else's district. I made that very clear at the beginning. And I'm not saying that 150 people is the end-all and be-all of what a shelter could be. We opened a shelter in Crown Heights. It's 132 families. It's probably about, Jocelyn, about 500 plus people. And it's given opportunity for people from that area of Brooklyn to keep their kids near the school. The shelter that we talked about will give people, adult families without kids, they won't be in the schools, to move forward. The other things you're mentioning, I get that if I'm living there, and I can understand your perspective, that you want to call them shelters because people are in them, but they are commercial hotels that will be gone as part of this plan. In terms of conveniently having it end at the end of our time, when I was at Legal Aid, I had plans on my shelf from people that made promises they could do things in 2 years, they could do things in 3 years. When I was asked how long it would take to do this, I laid out how long it would take. And that's the plan that the mayor embraced. He ran on it, he was reelected. It's been very clear that we can't do it overnight, and that it takes bringing on new facilities and continuing the prevention and the rehousing programs we've got in order to achieve that end. I understand that that's bringing me into conflict with many of you people that I've worked with for years. And I don't want to be in that place, but I have to also run a system and be honest with the situation that we've got. And I don't want to have a fight with you, and I hope to keep looking for ways to work with you, even despite the disagreement we're having here.
But this is not working.
So Vinnie Curry was next, but humbly yielded his time to another chair since Councilmember Holden's going to go after Betty Brown.
Okay. I'll defer to the councilman.
No, please, I want to do it.
Yeah, it's going to be very difficult for community boards and certainly for elected officials to go to a community and say, they're looking for our help to find a site, but they will not give us a date. for when we're going to have the hotels cease being used. You know, because people in our districts are gonna say, yeah, we're gonna end up with both. And that's extremely problematic, especially with the hotel use in Queens. You know, following up on what Councilmember Adams said, you know, Southeast Queens and in Southwest Queens. Our hotels were built for the purposes of serving airport customers. This borough has both airports in the city. And the number of hotel rooms that are being taken up for the use by homeless services, you know, has an impact. It has an impact also, I believe, on our economic development. You know, tourism is a growing industry in this borough. And our ability to serve those tourists is being diminished. You know, so if the numbers are truly flat on the increase in homeless, then we should see no further hotel use. Just throw that out there.
Mr. Brown represents Resort World's.
Wasn't really a question, but, you know, it was more of a statement.
I think, I actually appreciate your comment. One of the challenges I have, though, is you're right, we held it flat for the first time in a decade. But we also had one of the coldest winters in a long time, which is how I got into trouble with my councilmember friend, that we took up a lot of hotel rooms to deal with the cold in a very quick way, which is not something we want to do, and I understand that that caused challenges in community board too, and other boards as well. So, from a macro perspective, we held it flat, but we also dealt with something that we didn't expect. Ultimately, we won't have to be dealing with that once we've replaced all of these locations with ongoing shelters. But I do take your point, and we'll keep searching for ways to rebuild trust, because I think that's one of the challenges that we've got in a system in which, you know, until about a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago, everything just got open in the middle of the night, whether it was a permanent shelter or not. And you didn't know where there are hotels. You might not like the fact we're giving you 24 hours notice, which is when we're getting into them, but we've changed that approach and trying to have things not be secret. But I get we have a lot of ground to work with, and I appreciate the spirit of your question, or comment.
So we're going to go Councilmember Holden, Councilmember Koo, Vinnie is then going to go from Board 5, Denise, and then Grudenchik. And let everyone remember that there's a lot of people asking questions. So thank you, Councilmember Holden.
I appreciate it, Commissioner, giving us some time. Why are hotel rooms more desirable than a cluster of apartments?
The conditions in those buildings are very challenging to have children in, and providing services to families with children in these sort of checkerboards, here's a room, here's not a room, is very different than providing services in a location in which you've got a critical mass of families with children. So it's both the conditions and the ability to deliver appropriate services and to maintain security.
But I would think a hotel room is really sometimes very small. You have a family living in a hotel room versus an apartment that's kind of run down, but it's still an apartment. So I don't think it's a blanket statement. I understand that, but I would think that, all right, you fix up the apartments, you know, one at a time, and then you put them back in the apartments, rather than transfer them to a hotel. But my second question, which I understand there's some disagreement on the clusters, and all different kinds of conditions for the apartments too. But you also said a couple of things. You said community first, which, you know, back in Maspeth, we got some mixed messages. We said, well, you know, you were telling us that it's the Maspeth community that needs to house them. Then it was the community board. Then it became the borough. Now it's the borough. So which is it? Like, you want to keep the residents in their communities, but then you say borough. So there's kind of two things. The mayor announced this, by the way, in January, I believe, in 2017, that he wanted to keep the kids who are going to school in their community, but that hasn't been done yet. We haven't seen that.
I don't think you're right about that. So ask the families with children that are at the first family shelter in Crown Heights who are able to get their kids to
Well,
school.
you can point out one shelter, but
Let me
in
keep,
the case of
if I
the
could,
city view,
if I can keep going. So this first shelter in the Riverdale Community Board that's ever been developed, and those kids are able to go to the local school there. So we've got the first 11 up and running. By the way, the Koch-Dinkin shelter plan, the entire shelter plan was 11 shelters. I'm sorry, 13 shelters. So we're moving at this in as quick a pace as possible. But to answer your questions, it was always announced as a borough-based plan, and within the borough, we want to get people as close as possible to the communities from which they came, so that the kids can go to school, so that people can continue to attend the houses of worship. And ultimately, we have to give ourselves the capacity to do that. We don't have the capacity to do that throughout the entire city and throughout every borough.
what happened to the mayor's advisory board that he announced, community siting? That was announced over a year ago. Is that still alive, or is that another idea that?
For any new shelter we open, there is a community advisory board. And every one of the 11 is up and operating, has a community advisory board.
But before the siting, though, that was the whole idea. The mayor announced that we want to go to a community advisory board to look at possible sites. Am I incorrect on that?
You are, actually, I hate to say this to a council
No, that's
member,
all right,
particularly you. You are incorrect on that. We're just forming a relationship that's different than our prior relationship. You're.
I can imagine that's so.
The announcement was we're going to create a different sort of relationship between a shelter and a community by requiring there to be a community advisory board for every shelter that's open, and that we would give the community 30 days notice before opening a permanent ongoing shelter. And we have done that for each of those 17 sites, and again, the average length between notification and opening has been 65 days.
Okay, but you are giving the council members some time to find sites, you did say that, to locate?
I announced this at the Brooklyn Borough Board last week, and you'll be getting letters from us shortly as well.
By the way, that shouldn't go unnoticed. They're looking for sites. Just keep that in mind, please, in your districts, chairs and council members. Councilmember Cruz.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Banks. I know I'm doing the job. You have a very tough job. And up to now, you mentioned all about numbers, right? How many people in shelter?
Yeah, just a little bit.
So up to now, you always talk about numbers. How many homeless people in Queens? How many in the city? But you haven't mentioned anything about the money. What is the budget we spend on homeless people? How much it costs each individual? Either in the shelter or in the hotel? Unless we have the last thing like you banks, but we all worry about it, Because pretty soon you'll bankrupt the city.
I think my last name is not what you think it is.
The banks.
It's not what you think it is. So, yeah.
So
it's a passport that my relatives used to get into this country many years ago to
my question is,
Europe.
We all have good hearts, right? We want to spend money, we want to help poor people on the streets. And another surprisingly is the economy is the best now. We have full economy. How come we have so many homeless people?
Because the economy may be doing well, but the housing market has not recovered from the loss of the units that we talked about before, the gap between rents and income, the fact we lost, I mentioned this before, 150,000 units of rent-regulated housing. I know I have a budget hearing coming up, and I know you had a lot of questions for the budget director, and I will be ready to answer them all fully when I testify.
So how much is the budget for homeless people? $1.4 billion?
As I said, you have the overall number, but I think at the budget hearing it'll be a better opportunity to go through all the numbers.
Just use last year's figure.
Yeah.
Last year's figure. How much we spent on homeless people? Each person.
You can't do an each person analysis.
Divided. The total budget divided by the person.
No, here's why you can't do an individual analysis. So 180,000 people have gotten legal services. That's in about 60,000 households. 71,000 households have gotten rental assistance. I'm sorry, 71,000 people have gotten rental assistance. That's about 27,000 households. So a lot of the focus is on how much you pay for shelter. And at the budget hearing, I'm going to explain to you how much we spend for all of
Because
these different
I
things.
understand the hotels cost you like $200 and something per day in Queens alone. In Manhattan is higher.
Our average, including social services, we do not pay for any night more than $220 a night. The average cost is $174.
In San Diego, in Queens?
Average citywide cost, and we don't pay more than we don't pay more than $250 for a room, and the average cost of a room, including social services, is $220.
So has your program done anything in terms of job training and teach these people find a new job or a second career, things like that? I think that's more important.
I agree with you that that's very important. It's one of the reasons why we've invested $200 million in the not-for-profit shelter providers so that we can improve the kind of services that are provided in the shelters. I think many of you have heard from the not-for-profit sector, and this is the first major investment in the not-for-profit sector to improve their ability to provide services, employment training being one of them.
This is the first part of it.
Thank you, I'm sorry, but we have about 10 to 15 more minutes, and so, again, questions and answers a little faster if we can. I know it's a lot to explain. Not lightning round, but we want to make sure that everyone gets a word in if they'd like to have one. Vinnie Curie, Ward 5?
Councilmember Van Bremer and I don't always agree, but I have to support him on a few things. Notification, it's not always there on time. So we understood there was going to be a church-sponsored shelter above the Ridgewood Older Adult Center for single men, and we had no problem. But they were moved in without any notification, we don't even think the facility was completed by the proposer. We know they weren't because some of those people have to go to Greater Ridgewood Restoration Corporation to get some services that aren't available, like a shower and things like that. So notification is not there. Jimmy said that. Talk about families, talk about communities. We have the most overcrowded district in the city, if not the country. District 24 and I think 22 also. From the school districts. So how, in your planning, could you prevent more overcrowding by not putting families in, with a lot of children in those districts? It's Corona, it's Long Island City, it's Woodside, it's Glendale, it's Ridge, we can't fit another shoe on another kid into the schools as it is. So that's a problem. The other thing Betty mentioned before, trust. You're going to ask us to give you sites. Well, we can't trust you now. And I've said that to you in the past. I can't trust you.
I'm sorry you feel that way. I think as the borough president said, we've been giving 30 days notice for the shelters that we have opened and 24 hours notice for these hotels. I'm not familiar with the facts of the particular place you're looking at, but we'll look into it and follow up with you. In terms of schools, I think you actually make exactly the point that I would want to make. You might not agree with me, but I embrace your point, which is the reason why we want to go to a borough-based and community-based approach is to be able to keep kids in the schools that they were in, as opposed to what we see throughout the city, not just in Queens, but I understand the particular issues with those districts you're raising. When you shelter people from other boroughs or other districts, it causes the problem that you're describing, which is the reason why we want a borough-based, community-based approach.
Denise? I would just like to add that I agree with everything Councilmember Van Bramer said. We feel the effects. We've had an increase in assaults. We had a mother punched in the face in the middle of the day walking from a park with her 5-year-old daughter, which would never have happened. We had a business owner also assaulted by someone living in the shelter. We've now opened 2 temporary shelters, and now we're hearing about a permanent shelter within a mile radius. It has negatively impacted our neighborhood, our businesses. It is ruining the fabric of our communities. And I'm very thankful on Thursday that Amanda has coordinated a community meeting on Thursday, but the consensus is, what good will it do? People want to come and explain how they feel, share their concerns, but will anything really change as a result of that? Additionally, I'd also like to ask in the Fairfield Inn, I know there are no kitchens in that facility. So why would that be chosen as a better site than, I understand everything you've said about the cluster shelters, but that hotel in particular does not have a kitchen. How is that suitable? We're getting adults. You changed that one facility from children, which we've had clothing drives. We've had holiday drives. We have welcomed people into our community. We have supported them. We have no problems with family. Now businesses are being impacted. You have people that have put their life savings into a business, one in particular, the Bantry Bay. The person came to community board, and they're losing business because of it. She told me, this one woman told me she worked 12 years to save up, and now these people are coming in, they're not paying, they're ordering things. It's just completely ruined the livelihood of Blissville, which is a very small community to begin with. And so I encourage you, I'm not sure if you're going to be there on Thursday, if you would come to listen to what people have to say and maybe reconsider if we have to have the Fairfield as a permanent shelter, then give us back the other 2 temporary ones that were just open.
I appreciate your comment. Jocelyn Carter will be there. I cannot be, but we also will have the NYPD there, and we can look into the issues that you're raising, but I appreciate your comment.
Can I just follow up on Denise's thing?
No. We have other people in other boards that have not spoken. I'm sorry, Councilman.
Okay, but he didn't answer the question, so.
I didn't answer the question because I said we'll hear what happens at the meeting, and the NYPD will be there as well, as long with Administrator Carter.
But there still won't be kitchens up there.
Oh, you're right. Let me answer that question. I thank you for.
And he got a follow-up. That's why he keeps it. That's why he fights for his district. Go ahead, quickly.
Thank you for raising that. I didn't mean to not answer that question. For shelters for families with children, all of those shelters will have cooking facilities. For shelters for adult families that do not have minor children, and for single adults, we do find that congregate meals work better for our delivery of services, to be able to get people in a congregate setting to address other issues in terms of our service delivery. It's different with families with young children, and that's why we focus on purpose-built shelters for families with young children, as opposed to necessarily purpose-built shelters for other groups of our clients.
Thank you. Councilmember Credential.
Thank you, Borough President. I will see the Commissioner along with Councilwoman Adams on the 27th at 10 a.m. I'll only be there 3 hours because I have my own committee to chair that afternoon. But, I have tremendous respect for you, Commissioner. I think that you're working hard, but I think we are running out of time in the sense that people, my district, members of the council, members of this community board don't feel like we're getting a bang for the buck. The amount of money that is being expended, and New Yorkers are big-hearted people, but I just don't sense that the numbers, I've said this to you before, I'll probably say it to you again on the 27th, the numbers, while flat, are not going in the right direction. And I know it's not easy. I have tremendous respect for your new hire, my former colleague, for Ms. Bonilla, my constituent in Eastern Queens. We have got to start turning this around. This is the wealthiest city on earth. We should be doing better by the people that need
I appreciate your comment, looking forward to the hearing, and remember, it's not all about shelters and census. Look at the other aspects of what we're trying to accomplish, but we'll talk more on the 27th.
All right, we have 4 more speakers, and then I'm going to shut it down. We have Raj, Ms. English, Clive, and Renee Chapman Hill is going to get the final say. So Raj.
Good evening, Commissioner. Thank you for coming. I cover Richmond Hill, Ozone Park, Kew Gardens, and Woodhaven.
Okay.
We have what I believe is the only drop-in center in Queens, which is on Atlantic
Correct.
Avenue. Breaking Ground is running it.
That's correct.
I will say, yes, we did get 30-day notice on that. However, the Comfort Inn Hotel across the street. My question is, how far in advance does DHS notify these hotels that they're going to be utilized? Because you're only given 24-hour notice, but if you move or use 30 rooms, doesn't that take a lot of planning? You're moving a lot of money to retain those rooms. Why are we only getting 24 hours notice? And by the way, I found that happened back in September. The residents of the building came to my October meeting furious because they didn't even know what was going on. So I was really, more or less about the transparency is really not there with the hotel portion. And the issue we have with the Comfort Inn, like I said, is, you know, we found out after the fact. And I know Amanda has been great in communicating afterward. But I just want to know how far in advance do you guys book these rooms for them?
So thank you for your comments on the drop-in center. The hotels, the commitment in the mayor's plan is 24 hours within placement. Sometimes that's only the amount of time that we have in terms of booking the rooms. We get lots of inquiries from lots of hotel owners that we never pursue them. And I can't tell you, we hear from you about that we're in a hotel, we hear from plenty of other people that you're gonna go into this hotel, and we say we're not, and then we don't. I realize that there have also been some times when we say we're not, and then circumstances a month or two later change. But the commitment on hotel notification by the mayor is 24 hours of placement, given the emergency circumstances of those placements.
Ms. English?
Hello, my area is East Elmhurst, Corona, and Jackson Heights. And there are 4 shelters that are based in basically East Elmhurst and Corona area, not in Jackson Heights. So we have LaGuardia Family Center that's on Ditmars, Clarion Hotel on Ditmars Boulevard, King's Inn, which was run by the Department of Homeless Services, and we didn't realize that it changed hands to Canva. And we have Agassiz. So I want to know, one of the shelters in the Clarion Hotel, will that be eventually be one of those that will be closed? That's run by the other landing.
I may defer to my colleague Jocelyn Carter, but off the top of my head, that is an actual shelter that we're operating, not a commercial hotel.
I think it is permanent.
Yeah, that's the landing shelter that used to be that. That's a shelter that was converted to it was a hotel that was converted to a actual operating shelter.
Right.
It's been operating for a while.
Yeah.
It predates the plan.
And then the LaGuardia Family Center, I remember you mentioned that they were community advisory board. I don't think there's a community advisory board at that location.
There is.
All right.
And someone from CB3 actually attended.
If
We're
I could,
happy to invite you though.
just on that point, which I think is that you raised a very important point, I'm glad you asked that question. Anything new we're opening has a community advisory board. We are doubling back to put community advisory boards in place where we can, and we've been prioritizing the new ones. We've had other locations where people who are on the community board leaders like yourself have said, hey, I don't have one. It wasn't the rule in the city to have them. And we've made a rule for anything new we'll have them, and we're trying to deal with anything existing if people want them. So we're happy to follow up with you
Well,
on
Ms.
that.
English, yours happens to have one, so it'd be nice if the representative made a report maybe to the community board at the next, if you could ask them to do that, that'd be great. Mr. Williams?
And we're happy to extend the invite, make sure you're on the email.
Commissioner, thank you for answering some of the questions. The public-private partnerships that could be pursued, given the exorbitant cost of this program, this homeless program, have you been pursuing any public-private partnerships? Given the tremendous profits that are being made by these large companies now, they must have some sense of giving back.
Well, it's one of the reasons why we are looking in this to close out so many of these relationships with the private landlords that ran the clusters and with the hotel owners and get to not-for-profit ownership and operations in these purpose-built shelters. In terms of our overall service provision, I think we've had a very good experience with public-private partnerships, but I think you put your finger on it. It's one of the reasons why we want to get out of these kinds of arrangements, for exactly the reason you're raising.
With respect to the 19 new facilities, can you give us a time that you're going to phase these over?
As Councilmember Bremer said, we're expecting to roll out the 90 facilities over the course of this 5-year period of time. We're 1 year in, and we've got 17 of them already announced, 11 of them already operating. We're going to keep building at that pace.
They would constitute tremendous savings to the rent. Now $200 and something per person per family.
Traditional shelters are more cost effective than hotels. It's one of the urgencies that we have, aside from service delivery and making services better for the human beings we're providing assistance to. We want to, we also see it as more cost effective to have traditional shelters than hotels.
Renee?
Thank you. Thank you. We have 4 shelters and 12 hotels that I know of. There's probably a lot more. My thing is the homeless, the assumption is that the homeless come from the boroughs. And I've met homeless in this system that from New Jersey, from other states. And so I have a problem because are you keeping numbers and where, do you keep statistics, like where they're coming from? And you're saying that you're going to keep them within their boroughs. If they're not from the boroughs, where they're going to be thrown right into Jamaica? Because I don't see any kind of pattern here of even New Yorkers being in these hotels, and we need to know the numbers on that. How many New Yorkers are in there? How many from the city?
I can tell you this, and I've said this before publicly, the vast majority of people in our shelter system are New Yorkers. In the olden days, before I was the commissioner, the city used to say, oh, we have all these people from out of state, but when you interview them and you look at their records, you found that they had a welfare case with us. So we have a lot of people that go elsewhere out of New York City, and then they come back because there's family here, and they say, oh, I was from New Jersey, or I was from here. But they were a year or two in New Jersey, and they're New Yorkers. And that is a really important point. If you go back and look at the public discourse from prior administrations, you say, oh, all these people are coming in. And we wanted to understand if that was true or not. And so we look for associated address information, and we try to make the best placements based upon where people have connections. But we have a lot of data that's available to us through the public assistance data and other information that we have in order to be able to make that work.
Okay. So I was going to ask Christina something really quick, because I know you had your hand up.
Thank you very much. Commissioner Banks, I did want to ask a little bit more about what Councilman Koo asked about, rehabilitating these people and giving them, as you said, you give them legal services and job advice. I mean, is there some sort of a length of time, or when we house the homeless, and believe me, anyone around this table could become one. I'm not, saying that, but is there a program, or are we determined to have them there for the rest of their lives?
No, we're very focused. As soon as people come into shelter, we have something called an independent living plan that is developed. It's reviewed every 2 weeks by the providers, and it's a plan aimed at how are people going to return to living independently in the community. And so employment training is part of that. Depending on whether or not someone's employable. Many people receive public assistance benefits from my other agency, HRA, and as part of that, they're required to be evaluated for employment and be connected to employment.
Now, how successful is that program?
It was very unsuccessful in my view in the past, and we've made significant changes. We phased out the WEP program that I know there was a lot of criticism about, and we've put in place over the last year new employment contracts with providers like America Works and others, and very reputable companies that we think will have a better outcome than previously happened.
Okay, thank you.
So I want to finish this with 2 quick things. Can you please give your contact information to folks around the table, whoever it is that you should contact?
Amanda Nasner, I'm the Queensborough Director. I've met a lot of your district managers. I've met with some of you. I'm going to share my email. It's Nasner. I'll spell it N as in Nancy, A, S as in Sam, N as in Nancy, E-R, and then it'll be a@dss.nyc.gov.
And what we'll do is Vicki will take that information and email it to all the chairs and the council members, but it's a different dynamic so that we can have a direct contact. Can you answer just one quick question? Shelters are zoned, I guess. What is the zone? About?
Full disclosure.
Okay.
I'll give you an answer.
Oh, you know the
Yeah,
answer.
I do.
Yes,
Okay.
So shelters are generally zoned as community facilities with sleeping accommodations. But they can also be zoned as transient hotels reflecting the nature of the population.
Okay.
So when we're going to open a particular facility, we work with the local Department of Buildings to ensure that the proper occupancy is met. But those are sort of the two pathways that facilities
And when you
open.
put a permanent shelter, is it normally long-term lease or normally a purchase? Normally.
In the past, it was normally a lease from a private entity to a not-for-profit. Going forward, we're looking to see if we can foster not-for-profit ownership, which we think is a positive way to go forward. But in the short run, obviously, we're going to put better programs in place, even if that means a regular lease arrangement. The not-for-profit ownership works better where the place is purpose-built. So BRC, our residence committee, just opened a purpose-built shelter in the Bronx. Wynn, run by Chris Quinn, is opening a purpose-built shelter in Coney Island, the first shelter for families with children in Coney Island ever. And so those are purpose-built and not-for-profit owned. Other arrangements we have are net leased, if you will, or fully leased, like the hotel on 58th Street in Manhattan, an SRO type setting that's going to become a shelter for single men, and one on 31st Street, which is for adult families in Manhattan. Those are two propositions in which a not-for-profit is net leased the entire building.
I appreciate the information. Everyone, thank you so much for a great meeting, and Commissioner, thank you so much for your time, your energy. We know you have a tough job, and we know that there's a lot of issues still to be worked out. Next meeting is April 16, 2018. Thank you, everybody. Happy Easter.
Yes, you are.